The weight of precision. The workshop smelled of gun oil and determination in the dim light of a West German winter evening, 1964. Edmund Heckler ran his calloused fingers along the cold steel of what would become the MP5, unaware that he was holding the future of modern warfare. Outside, the Cold War cast its shadow over a divided nation, while inside this modest facility, a humble engineer was about to redefine how elite soldiers would fight for the next 60 years. The metal was still warm from the lathe, its surface unmarred by the thousands of rounds it would eventually fire. Edmund held it up to the overhead bulb, studying the precision of each machined surface. 20 years had passed since he'd first picked through the twisted fragments of weapons in his father's bombed workshop, and still the mechanics fascinated him. The elegant mathematics of controlled violence, the poetry hidden in springs and bolts. Another late night, Heckler. Klaus Weber's voice carried a familiar mix of concern and skepticism. The senior engineer stood in the doorway, coat already buttoned against the December cold that seeped through Oberndorf's narrow streets. Around them, the Heckler & Koch facility hummed with the quiet efficiency of a company still fighting to prove itself worthy of the new Germany. "Just finishing some adjustments," Edmund replied, not looking up from his work. The delayed blowback system had been consuming his thoughts for months, a theoretical solution to a problem that had plagued submachine gun design since the Great War. Klaus stepped closer, examining the prototype with practiced eyes. The world was changing faster than military doctrine could adapt. Traditional submachine guns were crude, inaccurate beyond 50 meters, suitable only for desperate close-quarters combat. But the new conflicts emerging from decolonization, urban terrorism, and Cold War proxy battles demanded something different: precision at close range, reliability in chaos, and the ability to neutralize threats without destroying everything around them. "You're still chasing that impossible dream," Klaus said, shaking his head. "The physics don't support it, Edmund. If you could delay the bolt cycling without compromising reliability, someone would have done it already. The Americans, the British, they've got resources we can only imagine." Edmund finally looked up, his eyes reflecting the stubborn determination that had carried him through the lean years after the war. The German military establishment, still rebuilding its reputation, desperately needed innovations that would prove their engineering prowess to skeptical NATO allies. But this went deeper than national pride. It was about solving a problem that had haunted every urban battlefield. "Maybe they were thinking about it wrong," Edmund said quietly. "What if the solution isn't fighting the recoil, but delaying it just long enough for the bullet to clear the barrel?" Klaus laughed, but there was no mockery in it, only the affection of a colleague who had watched Edmund chase impossible problems for years. "You're trying to outsmart physics, my friend. But I suppose that's what engineers are supposed to do." After Klaus left, Edmund returned to his work. The silence of the workshop wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, broken only by the distant sound of trains carrying workers home to families and warm dinners. He thought of his own childhood, picking through debris with the curiosity of someone who understood that survival often depended on understanding tools. His father's words echoed in his memory. "The war is over, Edmund. No one wants German weapons anymore." Hans Heckler had spoken those words with the bitterness of a blacksmith who had lost everything to Allied bombs in 1943, watching his family's legacy reduced to rubble and twisted metal. But where his father saw shame, Edmund had seen opportunity. A chance to rebuild not just what was lost, but something entirely new. The prototype in his hands represented months of secret work, crafted during off hours when the factory was empty and his thoughts could run free. The first tests had been disasters. Jammed mechanisms, timing failures, even a catastrophic malfunction that nearly injured the operator. His supervisor had ordered him to abandon the project and focus on conventional designs for upcoming military contracts. But something inside him refused to give up. This weapon, if he could make it work, might represent more than just another military contract. It could be proof that innovation could emerge from the most unexpected places, that a humble engineer, dismissed by his peers, could fundamentally change how the world approached precision warfare. Outside the workshop windows, West Germany's winter settled deeper into the night. The divided nation carried its own weight of history, its own need to prove that it could contribute to peace rather than threaten it. In the Cold War's tense atmosphere, where proxy conflicts and urban terrorism were becoming the new battlefield, traditional military thinking seemed increasingly obsolete. Edmund picked up a small component, examining it under the light. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity. Delay the bolt's rearward motion just long enough for chamber pressure to drop, allowing the bullet to exit cleanly before the mechanism cycled. It challenged every assumption about immediate blowback systems, but the theory was sound. Tomorrow would bring another round of skepticism from procurement officers who wanted proven designs, not experimental concepts from a company still fighting for international credibility. But tonight, in the quiet of his workshop, Edmund Heckler held the future in his hands without knowing it. The smell of gun oil and metal lingered in the air as he finally shut off the lights and locked the workshop door. In a few hours, he would return to continue the work that consumed him. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Oberndorf, the world continued its slow dance of conflict and tension, unaware that the solution to one of its most persistent problems was taking shape in the hands of a German engineer who refused to accept that some dreams were impossible. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. How long can a man carry two conflicting truths without breaking? The morning brought frost and doubt in equal measure. Edmund arrived at the Heckler & Koch facility before dawn, his breath visible in the December air as he unlocked his workshop. The prototype sat exactly where he had left it, but in daylight it seemed less like a revolutionary breakthrough and more like an expensive mistake waiting to happen. The company had secured a meeting with German military procurement for the following week. They wanted conventional designs, proven submachine gun concepts that could be manufactured quickly and deployed immediately. What they decidedly did not want was experimental technology from engineers with more ambition than sense. Still tinkering with your pet project? Gerhard Koch himself stood in the doorway, the company founder's presence filling the small workshop with an authority that 20 years of successful manufacturing had earned him. Edmund had apprenticed under Koch after the war, learning precision manufacturing while secretly studying the submachine guns that had flooded Europe during the conflict, the British Sten, the American Thompson, the Soviet PPSH-41. Each design teaches us something, Edmund said carefully, not wanting to reveal how much hope he had invested in this particular experiment. The fundamental problem remains. How do you create a weapon that fires pistol ammunition with rifle-like accuracy? Koch picked up the prototype, his experienced hands reading the craftsmanship like a familiar language. The older man had survived the transition from wartime production to peacetime reconstruction, navigating the complex politics of a country trying to redefine its relationship with military technology. The problem, my young friend, is not technical, it's commercial. Our clients want reliability they can trust, not innovations they must gamble on. Edmund understood the tension. Traditional blowback systems were simple but violent, causing the bolt to slam back immediately upon firing, disrupting aim with each shot. The violence of the mechanism made precision impossible at the distances where modern conflicts were actually fought, in city streets, inside buildings, anywhere that civilian lives hung in the balance. But the solution that had come to him during a sleepless night seemed almost too elegant to work. What if the bolt could be engineered to remain closed for a fraction of a second after firing, allowing the bullet to exit the barrel before the mechanism cycled? It challenged conventional wisdom that immediate cycling was necessary for reliability. "Give me one test," Edmund said quietly. "One proper test with adequate ammunition and targets at realistic ranges." Coke studied him for a long moment. Outside the workshop, the sounds of morning production filled the air. Lathes turning, hammers ringing, the rhythm of a company building its reputation one component at a time. West Germany in 1964 was still proving itself to skeptical allies, still demonstrating that its engineering excellence could serve peace rather than threaten it. "One test," Coke agreed finally. "But if this fails, you focus entirely on the procurement presentation. We cannot afford to chase dreams when the company's future depends on practical contracts." The afternoon test took place at a private range outside Oberndorf, with only Coke and a single technician present. Edmund had handcrafted the prototype using a modified roller-delayed system inspired by the wartime MG-42 machine gun, but adapted for the lighter recoil characteristics of pistol ammunition. The first shots were promising. The weapon cycled smoothly, feeding ammunition without jamming. But accuracy remained the crucial test. Traditional submachine guns scattered bullets across man-sized targets at 100 meters, useful only for suppressive fire in desperate situations. Edmund aimed carefully at the target downrange, conscious that months of work had led to this moment. The delayed blowback system should allow for controlled recoil, keeping the weapon steady during rapid fire. In theory. The burst of shots cracked through the winter air with a different sound. Sharper, more controlled than the violent chatter of conventional designs. When they walked downrange to examine the target, Coke's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine surprise. Where traditional designs would have scattered impacts across the entire target, Edmund's creation had grouped shots within a dinner plate-sized area. The recoil was so controlled that rapid-fire bursts remained manageable, almost surgical in their precision. "Mein Gott," the technician whispered. "It actually works." But Coke's mind was already moving beyond the immediate success to larger implications. If this technology could be refined and manufactured, it might represent exactly the kind of innovation that could establish Heckler & Koch as more than just another small arms manufacturer. "How many people know about this?" Koch asked quietly. "Just us," Edmund replied. "And Klaus, but he thinks it's impossible." The older man nodded slowly, understanding the delicate position they occupied. News of revolutionary weapons technology had a way of attracting attention. From competitors, from foreign intelligence services, from bureaucrats who might not appreciate the geopolitical implications of German engineering excellence in military applications. As they packed up the test materials, Edmund felt a mixture of elation and unease. The weapon worked, better than he had dared hope. But success brought its own complications. This was no longer just a theoretical exercise or a personal challenge. If they could refine the design and bring it to production, it might change the fundamental nature of close-quarters combat. On the drive back to Oberndorf, Koch spoke carefully about the future. Military procurement would want documentation, testing data, performance comparisons with existing weapons. But they would also want assurance that the technology was genuinely German innovation, not some adaptation of foreign designs that might create diplomatic complications. That evening, Edmund returned to his workshop with renewed energy, but also growing awareness of what he had set in motion. The weapon that had emerged from his theoretical calculations now existed as physical reality. It could be manufactured, deployed, used in conflicts around the world. The workshop smelled different somehow. Still gun oil and determination, but now also anticipation and the weight of responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, refining the design, preparing documentation, convincing skeptical procurement officers that revolutionary technology was worth the risk. But tonight, in the quiet of his workspace, Edmund Heckler understood that he had crossed a line. The mathematical elegance that had driven his innovation was taking on practical dimensions. and with those dimensions came questions he had not yet considered. Outside his windows, West Germany's Cold War tensions seemed suddenly more personal. His weapon, for it was undeniably his now, might soon be carried by soldiers whose precision could mean the difference between life and death, between surgical operations and tragic accidents. What would you remember more, hunger or kindness? The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in January, delivered by a military courier who waited while Edmund read its contents. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Müller, newly assigned to Germany's Experimental Special Operations Unit, requested a private demonstration of innovative close-quarters weapons systems. The language was careful, bureaucratic, but the implications were clear. Word of the successful test had reached ears that mattered. Edmund looked up from the letter to find Klaus watching him with knowing eyes. The senior engineer had been quietly investigating the prototype project, asking careful questions about materials requisitions and overtime hours. "So it's true then," Klaus said. "Your impossible dream actually works." The demonstration was scheduled for the following week at a military facility outside Stuttgart. Edmund spent the intervening days refining the prototype, adjusting tolerances, and preparing documentation that would satisfy military procurement standards. But beneath the technical preparations lay deeper questions about what success might mean. Lieutenant Colonel Müller arrived precisely on time, accompanied by two specialists whose credentials remained diplomatically vague. The officer carried himself with the careful confidence of someone who had served in Korea and understood that future conflicts would be fought in urban environments where precision mattered as much as firepower. "Herr Heckler," Müller said, extending his hand, "your reputation precedes you. We understand you've developed something that challenges conventional wisdom about submachine gun design. The demonstration took place in a specially constructed urban warfare training facility. Concrete rooms, narrow corridors, scenarios designed to replicate the close-quarters combat that was becoming increasingly common in Cold War proxy conflicts. Traditional submachine guns were adequate for suppressive fire, but inadequate for situations where innocent lives hung in the balance. Edmund explained the delayed blowback system while the specialists examined the prototype. The theory was complex, but the results were simple. Surgical precision in confined spaces, controllable automatic fire, accuracy that bordered on the impossible for a weapon of this type. When the shooting began, the specialists' expressions shifted from professional interest to genuine amazement. Shot after shot, grouped within impossible tolerances, even during rapid-fire bursts. The weapon's accuracy seemed to defy its submachine gun classification entirely. "Extraordinary," one of the specialists murmured, examining the targets. "This changes the fundamental equation for hostage rescue, counter-terrorism operations, any situation requiring precision in confined spaces." Miller nodded slowly, but his expression remained thoughtful rather than enthusiastic. The officer understood better than most the complex implications of revolutionary military technology. "How quickly can this be put into production?" he asked. "That depends on manufacturing authorization and procurement contracts," Edmund replied. "The design is ready, but tooling and testing will require months." After the demonstration, Müller requested a private conversation. They walked along the facility's perimeter fence, breath visible in the January air as the older man chose his words carefully. "You understand what you've created here?" Müller asked. "This weapon doesn't just solve technical problems. It creates strategic possibilities that didn't exist before." Edmund nodded, though he was still processing the full implications himself. The mathematical elegance that had driven his innovation was taking on profound moral dimensions. He had created a tool that could save hostages, but also one that made killing more efficient. "I've served in conflicts where civilian casualties weren't just tragic accidents, they were strategic failures," Müller continued. "Your weapon could change that calculus fundamentally, But that also means every shot fired represents a moment where precision means the difference between life and death. The conversation haunted Edmund during the drive back to Oberndorf. Success was no longer theoretical. Military procurement was already discussing production contracts, testing protocols, deployment timelines. Within months, his weapon might be carried by German special forces, then potentially by Allied units facing similar operational requirements. That evening, Edmund found himself walking through Oberndorf's quiet streets, past the rebuilt structures that had replaced wartime bomb damage. The town carried its own weight of history, its own transformation from destruction to peaceful productivity. His father's blacksmith shop had been rebuilt as a small machine shop, serving local farmers and craftsmen rather than military contractors. He thought about his father's bitter words, "No one wants German weapons anymore." The older man had spoken from grief and loss, watching Allied bombs destroy everything his family had built. But now German engineering excellence was being requested by those same former enemies, recognized as potentially crucial for maintaining peace rather than threatening it. The irony was not lost on Edmund. The weapon emerging from his workshop might become a symbol of post-war German engineering excellence, proving that the country could contribute to global security rather than threaten it. Orders might flow in from Allied nations, establishing Heckler & Koch as a premier small arms manufacturer and validating his vision. But success carried unexpected weight for its creator. The theoretical challenge that had consumed sleepless nights was becoming operational reality. Soon, soldiers would carry his weapon into situations where split-second decisions could save innocent lives or create tragic accidents. Back in his workshop, Edmund held the prototype one final time before locking it in the company's safe. Tomorrow would bring meetings with procurement officers, discussions about production timelines, negotiations over performance specifications. The quiet phase of innovation was ending. The complex phase of implementation was beginning. The workshop still smelled of gun oil and determination, but now also of anticipation and responsibility. Outside the windows, West Germany's winter night settled over a nation still defining its place in the post-war world. His weapon, for it was undeniably his creation now, might soon play a role in conflicts he could not imagine, carried by soldiers whose precision could prevent tragedies or cause them. The mathematical challenge that had driven him was becoming something larger and more complex, a technology that could reshape the fundamental nature of precision warfare, for better or worse. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. If you came home with this story, who would you dare to tell? The procurement meeting in February felt less like a technical review and more like a diplomatic negotiation. Edmund sat across from a panel of military officials, NATO observers, and industry representatives. The prototype weapon disassembled on the conference table like evidence in a trial. The delayed blowback system that had consumed months of development was now reduced to charts, graphs, and performance specifications. Colonel Friedrich Weber, no relation to Edmund's colleague Klaus, led the questioning with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades evaluating military technology. The West German procurement system in 1964 carried special burden. Every weapon system had to satisfy not only operational requirements, but also political sensibilities of allies still wary of German military capabilities. Your design challenges fundamental assumptions about submachine gun mechanisms, Colonel Weber observed. Can you explain why established manufacturers have not pursued similar approaches? Edmund had prepared for this question, but the answer was more complex than technical specifications could capture. Traditional blowback systems were simple but violent. prioritizing reliability over precision. Most manufacturers assumed that submachine guns would be used for suppressive fire rather than accurate shooting, making precision secondary to cyclic rate and mechanical durability. "The operational requirement is changing," Edmund replied carefully. "Urban conflicts, counter-terrorism operations, hostage rescue situations, these demand precision that traditional designs cannot provide." A NATO observer leaned forward, studying the documentation. "Your test results indicate accuracy comparable to rifles at ranges where submachine guns typically become ineffective. How do you explain this performance improvement?" The technical explanation was elegant. Delaying the bolt's rearward motion until chamber pressure dropped allowed the weapon to remain steady during firing, eliminating the violent disruption that made traditional designs inaccurate. But the implications were more profound than mechanical improvements. This weapon could fundamentally change tactical doctrine for special operations, Lieutenant Colonel Mueller added. Situations that currently require separate teams with different weapon systems could be handled by smaller units with greater precision. The discussion continued for hours, covering manufacturing requirements, testing protocols, production timelines. But Edmund sensed undercurrents of concern that transcended technical considerations. Revolutionary military technology created ripple effects that extended far beyond immediate operational applications. During a break, Edmund found himself in conversation with Dr. Hans Richter, a civilian consultant who specialized in arms control implications of emerging weapons systems. The older man's questions were pointed but not hostile. "You understand that successful weapons technology rarely remains confined to its original users?" Dr. Richter asked. "If your design proves effective, it will be copied, adapted, and eventually proliferate to users you never intended to serve." The question had haunted Edmund's thoughts since the successful demonstrations began. Mathematical elegance was morally neutral. The delayed blowback system worked equally well, regardless of who pulled the trigger or what targets they engaged. Success in solving one problem inevitably created new problems he had not anticipated. That afternoon, the panel authorized limited production for field testing. 50 weapons would be manufactured for evaluation by German special forces, with potential for expanded production pending operational results. It was everything Edmund had hoped for, but acceptance brought unexpected anxiety rather than satisfaction. The drive back to Oberndorf took him past snow-covered fields where farmers were preparing for spring planting. The peaceful landscape seemed disconnected from conference rooms where military officials discussed weapons performance and tactical applications. His innovative solution to an engineering challenge was becoming operational reality, with implications he was still struggling to comprehend. Back at the Heckler & Koch facility, Klaus greeted him with knowing sympathy. The senior engineer understood the complex emotions that accompanied successful innovation in military technology. "Congratulations seem inappropriate," Klaus observed wryly, "but you've achieved what you set out to accomplish. The weapon works, procurement is satisfied, and production contracts are approved." "Then why do I feel like I've opened a door I can't close?" Edmund replied. The workshop felt different that evening. Where once it had been a place of theoretical exploration and creative problem-solving, it now seemed like the birthplace of something larger and more consequential. The tools and equipment that had shaped the prototype would soon be scaling up for production, creating dozens, then hundreds of weapons that would be carried by soldiers in situations he could not predict. Edmund picked up his original hand tools, remembering the careful craftsmanship that had gone into each component. The roller-delayed system that had been born from wartime MG-42 inspiration was becoming the foundation for an entirely new category of precision weapons. But craftsmanship was giving way to manufacturing, innovation to implementation. Outside his workshop windows, Oberndorf's evening lights reflected the quiet prosperity of a town rebuilt from wartime destruction. His father's rebuilt machine shop served peaceful purposes now. Agricultural equipment, construction tools, the mundane but essential technology of civilian life. The contrast with his own work felt increasingly sharp. The phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. Lieutenant Colonel Miller's voice carried news that field testing would begin earlier than anticipated. Special operations units were facing operational requirements that demanded immediate solutions. "How soon can the first production weapons be ready?" Miller asked. 6 weeks for the initial batch, Edmund replied, longer for full production capability. After the conversation ended, Edmund realized that his theoretical innovation was becoming operational reality faster than he had anticipated. Within weeks, soldiers would be carrying his weapon into situations where precision could save lives or end them. The mathematical elegance that had driven his work was taking on moral weight that equations could not quantify. The workshop smelled of gun oil and anticipation, but also of responsibility and consequence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: supervising production setup, training technicians, ensuring quality control. The quiet phase of individual innovation was ending. The complex phase of technological impact was beginning. What happens when the thing you create exceeds your ability to control it? The call came at 3 a.m. on October 18, 1977, 13 years after Edmund had first imagined the delayed blowback system that now bore his name. Klaus Weber's voice carried an urgency that cut through sleep-fogged confusion. "Turn on your radio," Klaus said. "Mogadishu, they're using your weapon." Edmund stumbled to his kitchen radio, tuning through static until he found the BBC World Service. The hijacked Lufthansa airliner, 4 days of negotiation, the impossible rescue that everyone said couldn't be done. And then the reporter's words that made everything real. German GSG-9 operators stormed the aircraft with surgical precision, using specialized weapons that allowed them to neutralize threats without endangering the hostages. His MP5. The weapon that had emerged from his workshop was being used at that very moment, 3,000 miles away, in a situation where precision meant the difference between life and death for 90 innocent passengers. Edmund sat in his kitchen as dawn broke over Oberndorf, listening to reports that seemed to describe something from another world. The hijackers were eliminated, the hostages freed, not a single innocent life lost. The weapon's accuracy had allowed operators to take shots in a confined aircraft cabin that would have been impossible with traditional submachine guns. When he arrived at the Heckler & Koch facility that morning, the switchboard was already overwhelmed with calls from military procurement officers, police departments, and security agencies around the world. The Mogadishu rescue had demonstrated capabilities that transformed theoretical performance specifications into operational reality. "We've received preliminary inquiries from 12 different countries," Gerhard Koch announced at the emergency staff meeting. The British SAS, American Special Forces, French GIGN. Everyone wants to know about procurement timelines and training requirements. Edmund listened to the discussions about expanded production, international contracts, and licensing agreements with a mixture of pride and unease. The mathematical elegance that had driven his innovation had just saved 90 lives in the most public demonstration imaginable. But success carried implications he was still processing. That afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Müller, now promoted to full colonel, arrived at the facility with classified footage from the Mogadishu operation. In the secure conference room, Edmund watched grainy images of operators moving through the aircraft with precision that seemed almost surgical. His weapon allowed them to neutralize threats in spaces where traditional firearms would have created unacceptable risks. "Your delayed blowback system made this possible," Müller said quietly. "Without that precision, we would have been forced to accept casualties among the hostages. The tactical equation changed completely because of what you created here." But the footage also showed something Edmund had not anticipated: the psychological impact of precision on the operators themselves. These were not conventional soldiers spraying automatic fire in desperate situations. They were professionals taking carefully aimed shots in confined spaces, knowing that each bullet had to find exactly the right target. "How do they live with that responsibility?" Edmund asked. "The same way you live with creating the tool that makes it possible," Müller replied. "By understanding that precision can save innocent lives, even when it requires taking others." That evening, Edmund found himself in his old workshop, now converted to a small office since production had moved to larger facilities. The original prototype sat in a display case, a museum piece commemorating innovation that had changed modern warfare in ways he had never imagined. He held the weapon one more time, feeling its familiar weight and remembering the sleepless nights when delay blowback had been only theoretical. The mathematical challenge that had consumed him was now operational reality around the world. British SAS, American Delta Force, French GIGN, all carried his design into situations where precision meant everything. But success carried unexpected weight for its creator. Edmund watched news footage of his weapon being used in operations around the world, knowing that each shot fired represented a moment where precision meant the difference between life and death. The mathematical elegance that had driven his innovation had taken on profound moral dimensions. He had created a tool that could save hostages, but also one that made killing more efficient. The phone rang, interrupting his reflection. An American military attaché wanted to discuss procurement of MP5s for specialized units facing similar operational requirements. The conversation was professional, technical, focused on performance specifications and delivery timelines. But after hanging up, Edmund realized that his weapon had become something larger than individual innovation. It was now a symbol of precision warfare, proof that technological excellence could serve humanitarian purposes. The German arms industry, once viewed with suspicion by the international community, was now leading innovation in small arms technology. Orders flowed in from allied nations, establishing Heckler & Koch as a premier small arms manufacturer and validating his vision. His MP5 had become a symbol of post-war German engineering excellence, proving that the country could contribute to global security rather than threaten it. Yet questions remained that technical specifications could not answer. In creating a tool for precision, had he also created a tool for more efficient violence? The delayed blowback system worked equally well for hostage rescue and assassination, for protecting innocents and eliminating targets. Mathematical principles were morally neutral, but their applications were not. The workshop where it all began still smelled faintly of gun oil and determination, though it had been years since manufacturing took place there. Outside the windows, Oberndorf's lights reflected the prosperity of a company and community transformed by innovation. His father's rebuilt machine shop continued serving peaceful purposes, but the contrast with his own legacy felt increasingly complex. Tomorrow would bring new orders, new applications, new situations where his weapon would be used in ways he could not predict or control. The theoretical challenge that had driven him had become technological reality with implications that extended far beyond individual innovation. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. Who carries the weight of what we create? Edmund Heckler died quietly on December 28, 1990, 26 years after he had first imagined delaying a bolt's rearward motion by fractions of a second. The obituaries described him as an innovative engineer whose MP5 design had revolutionized modern warfare, but they could not capture the complexity of his relationship with his own creation. In his final years, Edmund had often returned to his original workshop, now preserved as a small museum within the expanded Heckler & Koch facility. The prototype sat in its display case like an artifact from a simpler time, when innovation was theoretical and consequences were abstract. Klaus Weber, himself retired but still visiting the facility regularly, found Edmund there on one of his last visits. The old engineer sat quietly before the display case, studying the weapon that had made their company's reputation and changed the nature of close-quarters combat around the world. "Any regrets?" Klaus asked gently. Edmund considered the question with the careful thought that had characterized his approach to every technical challenge. The MP5 had accomplished everything he had hoped for and more. Within a decade of Mogadishu, elite units across the globe had adopted it as their standard close-quarters weapon. British SAS, American Delta Force, French GIGN, all recognized that his delayed blowback system had solved a fundamental problem in small arms design. "I solved the problem I set out to solve," Edmund replied slowly. "Urban warfare, hostage rescue, counter-terrorism operations, the weapon provides precision that saves innocent lives. But precision can serve any purpose, not just the ones I intended." Through the workshop windows, they could see the expanded manufacturing facility where hundreds of MP5s were produced each month. The weapon had become synonymous with professional special operations, appearing in conflicts from Northern Ireland to the Middle East, always in the hands of those who needed to be absolutely certain of their shots. But success had brought moral complexity that engineering school had never addressed. The delayed blowback system that made the MP5 so precise also made it efficient for purposes Edmund preferred not to contemplate. Precision could save hostages, but it could also eliminate targets with clinical efficiency. Mathematical elegance was morally neutral. "Do you remember what your father said?" Klaus asked. "No one wants German weapons anymore?" Edmund smiled at the memory of his father's bitter words spoken in the ruins of their bombed workshop in 1943. Hans Heckler had been wrong about many things, but his skepticism had been understandable. The idea that German engineering excellence could once again serve international security rather than threaten it had seemed impossible in those desperate years. Yet the MP5 had accomplished exactly that. Orders from Allied nations had validated Edmund's vision and established Heckler & Koch as a premier manufacturer. The weapon became proof that post-war Germany could contribute to global peace rather than undermine it. Innovation emerging from the most unexpected places had fundamentally changed how the world's elite soldiers approached their most dangerous missions. In the months before his death, Edmund had watched the Berlin Wall fall and Germany begin reunification. The Cold War tensions that had shaped his world were giving way to new challenges, new conflicts that would require different solutions. But his weapon would remain, carried by soldiers facing situations he could not imagine. The legacy extended far beyond any single operation. Edmund's delayed blowback system had influenced an entire generation of small arms design, proving that true innovation required the courage to challenge accepted limitations. Sometimes the most important advances came from those willing to imagine what others considered impossible. But personal legacy was more complex than professional achievement. Edmund had never married, never had children to carry on his name or inherit his workshop. The MP5 was his offspring, produced in countless copies and carried across the world by soldiers whose precision could prevent tragedies or cause them. In his final conversation with Klaus, Edmund had reflected on the moral weight that accompanied technological success. Every shot fired from his weapon represented a moment where precision meant the difference between life and death. The mathematical elegance that had driven his innovation had taken on human dimensions he was still trying to understand. "I created a tool," Edmund had said. "What people do with tools is beyond the control of those who make them. But that doesn't absolve us of responsibility for thinking about consequences." The funeral was small, attended by colleagues and competitors who understood what Edmund had accomplished. Colonel Müller, himself retired, spoke briefly about how the MP5 had made surgical precision possible in situations where traditional weapons would have created unacceptable casualties. Representatives from Allied militaries acknowledged how German engineering innovation had contributed to international security. But the truest memorial was already in place, the weapon itself, still carried by elite operators who needed to be absolutely certain of their shots. The delayed blowback system continued solving the problem Edmund had identified. Precision at close range, reliability in chaos, the ability to neutralize threats without destroying everything around them. Years later, historians would debate whether Edmund Heckler understood the full implications of his innovation. The MP5 became more than a weapon. It became proof that true innovation required the courage to challenge accepted limitations. A humble engineer, dismissed by his father and doubted by his peers, had fundamentally changed how modern warfare was conducted. In the end, the workshop where it all began still smelled faintly of gun oil and determination. The original prototype remained in its display case, a reminder that mathematical elegance could reshape reality in ways both profound and troubling. Edmund Heckler had held the future of modern warfare in his calloused hands without knowing it, creating precision that would save lives and end them for decades to come. The weight of what we create outlasts those who create it. Innovation serves every purpose equally, and genius cannot choose its legacy. Sometimes the most important question is not whether we can build something, but whether we should, and whether we can live with what we unleash upon the world. How do we measure the true cost of precision?